Tonight, we won't follow maps inked to please kings, nor trace the neat blue lines that pretend to measure oceans. Instead, we'll drift beside a lantern's slow sway, where the air smells of ink and salt, and the sea keeps its own arithmetic. The rigging hums a single tired note. A quill taps against paper like a pulse learning how to count. And somewhere between that rhythm and the creak of a restless hull, a captain begins his double story. One book tells the crew what they can sleep on. Short miles, kind winds, the promise that tomorrow will behave. The other waits for the crown numbers polished, leagues stretched, tempers hidden behind flourishes of ink. Between them, truth rocks in its hammock, neither drowned nor dry. The ocean doesn't mind. It's used to being rewritten, so lower the lights. Let the sound of the pages replace the sound of waves. And if your breathing begins to match the slow beat of the lantern against its chain, that's just the ship remembering how to lie politely. If quiet voyages like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next log will remember you there. And somewhere in that half-dark between lantern and ink, the captain exhales. The page waits, blank but expectant, as if the sea itself were holding its breath. Outside, the water sounds patient too patient, and the ropes answer each wave with a low, tired creak. In this rhythm, stories learn to measure themselves. The quill dips, lifts, then hesitates just long enough for truth to consider arriving, before politeness signs in its place. Now the other ledger opens its quiet mouth. This one waits for the captain's cabin or the stern bench when everyone else is busy squinting at a cloud. It is the book for the crown, for sponsors, for the idea of Spain rendered in ink and gold thread. Here the miles regain their full height. Bearings are crisp. Dead reckonings are given the dignity of decimals. The crew's encouraging roundings are unrounded, like a bell without the felt muffler. Experiments sneak into the margins, whether a sand glass slipped a finger width, whether the lead line felt coral or wishful thinking. This second book is a future argument, not a bedtime story. It is designed to be believed by people who are not seasick. It carries the parts of truth that travel well across a palace floor and make curtsies pause. A neat column of figures is a kind of salute. A neat contradiction is a kind of insurance. Both are entertaining at court, which is helpful when your audience wears velvet. The two books sit like twins that learn to dress differently. The cruise log measures morale as much as longitude. A shortened mile is a small piece of mercy, like extra salt pork that pretends not to be extra. On hard days, the book adjusts expectations the way a lazy sundial leans toward afternoon. It is not perjury, it is hospitality. Meanwhile, the crown's ledger gathers the crisp items that bureaucracy enjoys, latitudes that stand up straight, courses that do not slouch, and dates that make sense when auditors frown at them. You can practically smell the ribbon that will tie it. The captain moves between these volumes like a translator who knows which synonym to choose when the room changes. How does one edit the sea without the sea noticing? The method is small. A league becomes a short league, as pliable as fresh bread. A headwind becomes moderate, which is sailor for unpopular but survivable. Bearings are drawn as lines rather than moods. Latitude is cherished in the way people cherish heirlooms. Clean nightly, guessed politely, never discussed too loudly. Drift is called soft. Leeway is called expected. The numbers are nudged with 2 fingers. Politely, the way you move a paintbrush hair off a finished canvas. The sea does not object. It is too busy rehearsing its one vowel. The arithmetic of hope is repetitive, and that is the comfort of it. Each day's run meets a sanding block. Sharp corners become dull. If the sky frowns, the ledger waits until after supper to mention it. When you must live in a small wooden box for months, this becomes a kind of charity. Instruments provide alibis. The sand glass, for example, is a dignified liar. Grains clump when the air is damp. The glass turns shy. The minutes are stretched like taffy. It is very convenient. The compass flirts with the needle. The log line depends on knots tied by men who are thinking about garlic. The quadrant works best when the horizon behaves. Waves rarely audition. At night, the sky provides stars as if handing out witnesses. Some of them possess unpronounceable names. All of them are very old and not particularly invested in your arrival time, so the captain listens to them with respectful skepticism. He cross-checks with the swell, with the smell of weed, with the attitude of birds who refuse to be helpful. The ship's pilot, who keeps a memory of previous voyages arranged like buttons, adds his sense of hearish. When testimonies conflict, the nearest one wins. The nearest testimony is usually the one that allows people to finish dinner, because these are not just pages, they are audiences. The deck prefers progress to truth. Sleep occurs more easily when the numbers say the world is being folded into a smaller square with each watch. Men grow quiet when they see neat columns marching obediently down the page. Rumor, like mildew, loves damp corners. A tidy run dries the corners. Food tastes better when the night watch believes the sunrise is pointed toward land. The cruise ledger is therefore a morale tool that happens to use miles. It does not want mutiny, it wants yawns. It is excellent at producing yawns. The Crown's ledger wants something else. It wants roots and reasons. It wants a path you can embroider on a map and later claim as a thread already owned. It wants mistakes written in the grammar of improvement. Error becomes calibration. Delay becomes study. When the sponsor reads, they should see a corridor extending west, lined with polite footnotes, ending at a door marked, fund more ships. Writing for sponsors is a literary art no less than sonnets, just with more tar. Distances are framed as corridors rather than gambles. Sandbars that require extra care become opportunities for improved soundings. Storms that argued with the rigging become masterclasses in seamanship. The phrase new data performs the same duty as a fresh lemon for a fish that has traveled too long. The Crown appreciates this. Ministers love the smell of new data. It makes the committee room feel adventurous while everyone remains seated. The captain knows his verbs. He keeps discovered ready at all times because it is the most generous verb a page can carry. When you write discovered, the future lowers bureaucracy for you. It meets you halfway with seals and ribbons. You're scarcely home before the ribbon's shadow visits your table like an early sunset. It says, please sail again and bring the same grammar. The habit of 2 books changes the air on deck. You can hear it in how the bosun calls time. You can see it in how men roll their shoulders after hauling a brace. They stand as if the horizon had come closer while they were busy. This is a pleasant lie. It keeps joints from complaining loudly. There is a scene every voyage where a sailor taps the page with a tarred finger to confirm the good news. He does not need the exact figure, only the direction of the error. He wants to know that the ocean is admitting defeat. The page kindly confirms it. The morning after, the page will confirm it again. A ship can run on biscuits and exaggeration for an impressive amount of time. When pages meet shores, something interesting happens. Copies of the cruise legend, told out loud, move faster than copies of the Crown's facts, carried by couriers. Someone in a bay town will repeat a distance as told by a bosun's friend's cousin, and it will become the size of a loaf. Maps will adopt the phrasing from pilots' gossip, because pilots gossip more than they publish. Bays become mouthfuls rather than measurements. Islands double under wishful fog. It is not malicious, it is easy. The ear is a generous editor. Later, cartographers will correct the shapes with great ceremony, but maps have long memories. A wrong curve enjoys a long retirement and marginalia. If you enjoy modern analogies, this is a little like when a screenshot outpaces the correction, only with more salt and fewer keyboards. Nevertheless, corrections arrive. Land meets page, and one of them gives way. Pilot sound channels with lead lines and occasionally with optimism. Shore-based observers note that a cape does not exist where a sailor swore it had thrown a shadow on his beer. The neatest phrase in the Crown's ledger, "We made good westing," is proven in the most pedestrian way, with barrels hauled past warehouses and complaints from teamsters who hate sand in their carts. The ledger does not mind being humbled by a warehouse. In fact, it enjoys it. Ink becomes true when it stains receipts. Sponsors smile in a way that resembles rain trying not to be rain. The voyage is declared bold and in sections exemplary. Funds are considered for next year because if a corridor can be walked once, it can be walked again, preferably with spices. What do the two books teach? They teach that logs are instruments and a captain tunes them. They teach that truth at sea arrives in increments, salted and revised. The crew's book teaches people how to sleep. It asserts that danger has a schedule and that schedule can be kept. The Crown's book teaches governments how to dream expensively. It states that risk, if properly footnoted, can be sponsored. Between them, they keep leadership steady enough that signatures can be placed where signatures must be placed. When you read the pages side by side, the distances adjust like an accordion. The music becomes tolerable. Scurvy loses its argument for a moment while punctuation wins. The sea, which has not noticed any of this, continues to lengthen and shorten its single vowel. The arithmetic of hope is an old technology. Mariners inherit it the way people inherit porcelain, carefully with warnings and a box lined with family advice. A short leak is not a fraud, it is a cushion. If all miles were hard, truly hard, people would stay home and write essays about why the ocean does not deserve them. Instead, the ledger makes a handshake with the horizon. It says, "We will meet halfway, where your blue admits a little mercy and my ink admits a little pride." If you are still awake, you might like to know that some captains, honest people with rather stern chins, objected to this. They insisted on the most painful figure possible. Their crew loved them less. Their sponsors applauded them louder. There's always a market for severity on paper. Instruments continue their soft co-conspiracy. The sand glass is reset with a flourish that suggests authority. Experience is another device shaped like a brow that has seen fog. Smell of weed is a metric the modern world has tragically lost. Birds become bullet points. Clouds present testimony, and everyone agrees that the one shaped like a fish is a good omen, even when it is a very poor fish. When several testimonies clash, the solution is the nearest one. This is not laziness. It is policy developed by people who must sleep sitting up. A chart is amended by the most persuasive witness, and the most persuasive witness is often the person who brought biscuits. Audiences remain the true weather of a voyage. On deck, the desire is for quiet. The bosun's whistle prefers to supervise rope, not feelings. A tidy log is a blanket against mutiny. It gives the night watch a reason to finish the song without adding a coda about home. In the cabin, the desire is for credence. Numbers must be arranged in an order that looks like civilization. The incline of a course should slide across the page with the confidence of a road that is sure of its destination. Ministers approve of curves that respect margins. They approve especially of the word observed, which is the queen of bureaucratic verbs. Observed suggests witnesses. It suggests that someone squinted nobly and deserves a pension. When the voyage ends, the two books are not enemies. They are like stage directions and reviews. One kept people moving. The other helps the next play get funded. News travels. Bay towns adjust their maps. Cautious glories are spoken at dinners. Cartographers draw their best guesses with ink that will be outdated by lunch. The captain sits with both ledgers and a neat stack of smaller notes. No one will see notes about flies at noon. And a plank that will need love notes about a sailor who told the same joke for 6 weeks and made it new each time by forgetting it, none of this matters to the crown. All of it matters to a ship. The echo of the two books reaches farther than the voyage. It enters the grammar of future charts. A bay once sized by hunger retains its enthusiastic outline even after measurement. An island introduced by rumor retires to marginalia with a soft dignity and a Latin nickname. The phrase, "we made good westing," lasts like a proverb. Some proverbs look like numbers. Some numbers look like proverbs. The Atlantic enjoys both. Historians later argue about editing reality, which is a large phrase for a quiet habit. Editing reality at sea does not mean inventing a continent. It means flattening the roughness of a day so that another day can be endured. It is not justice. It is navigational floss. What then is the moral? If we are allowed such a thing before your eyes finally close, maybe it is that every journey asks for two stories, one to carry the people who must lift the ropes, and one to satisfy the people who must lift their eyebrows. Maybe it is that truth has gears. At low gear, the ship makes survival sense. At high gear, it makes archival sense. The kindness of a short league taught tired arms to keep rowing. The firmness of a full league taught treasurers to keep funding. Between the two, a wooden box managed to slide across an uncooperative planet. If you notice modern echoes, you are not wrong. We still keep public dashboards and private notebooks. We still tidy our miles for the room that wants applause. We still trim the day's run and small talks so that tension sits down and plays cards politely instead of kicking the door. Your phone's step counter and the King's Ledger are cousins who learned different table manners. The sunset does not mind. It keeps rehearsing the same color with barely perceptible edits. By this point, the quill has slowed. The lanternous circle has shrunk until it only illuminates the margin where a polite spiral says, "some." Outside, the one-vowel ocean is still practicing. The crew's book is closed with a palm that lingers because closing a good lie is like smoothing a blanket. The crown's book is closed with two fingers because propriety enjoys elegance. Both are placed where they will not slide when the ship gives its small shrug. The captain sits a moment, listening the way people listen to a stove on a winter night. Somewhere above, a rope remembers its knot. Somewhere forward, someone turns in their sleep and forgets to finish a complaint. The numbers can do that for you. They are not perfect. They are steady. And steady is the lullaby. Before the light goes, imagine the corridor of days behind, each with a small rounding that felt like a kindness given at the exact right time. Imagine the corridor ahead, not yet drawn, already asking to be edited just enough to fit inside a human evening. The sea will not notice. It has no concept of leagues, short or otherwise. It understands only wind spoken through a great mouth. We are the ones who make measurements for sleep. 2 books, 1 ocean, 1 ship that needed both to move. If your eyes close now, the ledgers will keep the watch. They have practiced this for centuries. They are very good at it. You might not think a captain could keep 2 perfectly reasonable versions of the same day and sleep well, but on a wooden world with ropes for veins, it helps. Lantern light leans across the desk as if it too were taking a position. The quill taps, not impatient, just rhythmic, like a dinghy nudging a pier. Outside, the rigging repeats its long, metallic lullaby, a sound that could be translated as, "Yes, yes, still here." One book opens with the resigned sigh of parchment that knows it will be fed comforting numbers. It is the book for the crew, the bedtime book, the story in which the horizon is a little less stubborn and the miles are more accommodating than they were at noon. It announces a day's run that feels attainable, the way a pillow announces sleep even to a restless head. A league is trimmed just enough to knock the edge off a sailor's worry. A headwind becomes moderate, which at sea is the opposite of dramatic. Dead reckoning is given a warm jacket of certainty. The sea is still large, yes, but in these lines she has the politeness to act like a corridor. If, by the time I finish telling you how a short lead can be as soothing as a hot drink, you find yourself still awake, you may subscribe for more tailies of carefully adjusted arithmetic. But truly, don't strain anything. The ocean has all might. So does this ink. The second ledger waits like a quiet guest at the same table. Its sentences sit up straighter. Its columns carry the frankness that ministers enjoy and auditors applaud in winter. Here the miles regain their full adult height. Bearings align and wear respectable shoes. Latitude is stated bravely, as if it never once played hide-and-seek with clouds. The captain writes for people who live on floors that do not tilt. He notes experiments tried at noon when the sun pretended to be a coy meal to the sky, a sand glass compared to a pulse, a lead line argued with, a murmur about variation that will be dignified into a report later. The margins, are tidy promises to the future about spice and souls, and the faint possibility of glory arranged into manageable invoices. This is the book for the crown. It is not untrue. It is simply the truth cleaned for company. Between the two volumes, the captain shuttles like a translator, bilingual in morale and money. To edit the sea, one does not take a knife to it. One takes a file to the day. Numbers are words with hats. Their style can be softened without removing the heads beneath. A league can be short, not a lie, just a unit that bends kindly around the ship's need to hope. Headwinds can be smoothed the way crew cut their hair before entering harbor, not to fool anyone, only to look less like a conversation starter. Bearings become lines instead of moods. Drift moves from verdict to rumor. The captain does not erase. He domesticates. The sea, enormous and easily bored, barely notices. She has been a vowel for 1,000 years, one long open sound, and will remain a vowel long after the ink has browned. In the arithmetic of hope, small additions of mercy compound. A watch ends not with despair, but with something you can sing around. At night, when the lantern makes a golden island on the table, hope has better handwriting than fear. Of course, there are instruments, little accomplices with brass faces and opinions that vary by humidity. The sand glass is the friend who insists it arrived on time, even when its coat is damp. Grains pause to gossip mid-fall. Minutes stretch like sailor stories on payday. The compass behaves, but only if the needle is in a mood to be a citizen. The logline depends on knots tied by men thinking about garlic and wages. The quadrant loves a straight horizon and sulks when waves insist on modern dance. At night, stars testify with the aloof confidence of ancient witnesses who know they cannot be subpoenaed. Pilots cross-check with swell and smell on birds' ideas about breakfast. If testimonies conflict, they do not hold a trial. They choose the nearest truth that still lets supper sit well. Accuracy is the ideal. Arrival is the need. The ship is a small city with no alleys, and cities with no alleys must avoid arguments. The first audience is the deck. Sleep is the only currency that beats rum, and a tidy log buys sleep in bulk. A shortened mile pulls grumbling out of bones and into harmless yawns. The bosun likes to look at the page before he shouts. It makes authority feel less like noise and more like policy. Rumor, which multiplies faster than rats and weighs less, finds fewer corners to nest in when the figures march down the parchment like obedient soldiers. We are making good westing, the page says over and over, as if westing were a polite guest being shepherded to its chair. Men hum, men stretch. Men stop explaining the wind to the wind. Morale is arithmetic with a human face. The second audience is not on board at all. It is a room with wood that does not creak and windows that do not forget to close. The sponsors, the crown, the careful chroniclers of money prefer words like observed and established and new route indicated. They do not wish to read that a headwind has been rebranded as character building. They wish to see that the world can be shaped into corridors and that those corridors can be named. The captain's pen adapts. Hazard becomes soundings required. Delay becomes additional observations. Storm becomes unfavorable demonstration by the local atmosphere. No one is fooled. Everyone is comforted. Sometimes the truth needs company more than it needs clarity. And so the narrative moves, polite as a procession, from hunger to gold, from weather to gospel, from guest to map. There's the gentle comedy of pages meeting shores. While ships are still rubbing salt from their eyes, a bosun's friend's cousin in a harbor tavern declares the bay to be mouth-sized. The island double, the channel a respectable person with new boots. Thus copies spread through mouths faster than through couriers. Cartographers will arrive with rulers and size and fix things. In the meantime, the coastline enjoys a brief, flattering portrait. Later, a clerk with ribbon in his day will write the exact version, but language takes its time traveling uphill. Maps keep small ghosts along their margins, a promontory that once winked, a shoal that wore the wrong hat. The important thing is that barrels roll from ship to warehouse, and teamsters mutter about sand. Ink becomes true when it stains receipts. That is the square meal of geography. The two books teach a lulling, practical theology. Logs are instruments, captains tune them. Truth at sea arrives in increments like biscuits in a careful hand. A day is revised, not rewritten. Leadership risks a small honesty here, saves a crew's sleep there, and signs where signatures must be placed. The ocean is not persuaded by adjectives, but men are, and ministers are, and maps are, and sometimes that is enough. You can see the doctrine in the posture of the crew after 3 good pages. Shoulders admit that land is somewhere ahead, even if the exact degree is a shy number. Laughter returns in tiny, civilized stanzas. A ship is a city without alleys, yes, but for a moment is also a village with a square and a bench, and the bench is the ledger. If you scan for modern analogies, they will wave back politely. We keep public dashboards and private notebooks. We adjust our step counters by forgetting the steps to the refrigerator. We present metrics to rooms that enjoy metrics while we whisper to tired people. It is almost done. The captain in his cabin is every project manager with 2 spreadsheets and 1 headache. His sand glass is your Wi-Fi. His compass is your calendar. Both misbehave in fog. Meanwhile, the sea remains an enormous vowel, uninterested in verbs. She lies under the keel, patient, ungraded, incapable of caring whether a league was short or tall. This indifference is liberating. It allows the captain to work the small gears of human happiness without asking the water his permission. He is not forging continents, merely rounding a day so that it can be carried. Each rounding is minor half a mile here, a kinder adjective there, but the accumulation is sleep. And sleep is the only cargo that always arrives. On a particular night that smells faintly of tar and ordinary dreams, the quill makes the final curve of a figure 8 and pauses as if considering retirement. The lantern dome holds a small universe of mauve dust and patience. From the deck comes a cough that has visited every voyage since ships learned to complain. The crew book closes with the confident clap of a blanket. The crown book closes with the polite shutting of a cabinet where things behave. The captain sits, a little burned, a little ink-stained, listening for the sound a wooden world makes when everyone in it has agreed to believe the same amount. Morning will do what mornings do. Blush without apology, complicate the horizon, ask the wind for a conversation. A new page will begin with weather, because weather is the author everyone respects. Distances will again be coaxed into manners. Instruments will be consulted like old uncles. And 2 ledgers will continue their dance. 1 for breath, 1 for budget. The books are not rivals. They are hands passing a bucket along a human chain, removing water, adding time, moving hope. You might wonder whether this had it this neat. Adjustable corridor between hard ocean and soft ink ever bent history into a shape that felt too comfortable. It did sometimes, though not as often as suspicion thinks. It mostly bent mood. The crew's book took the terror out of dawn. The crown's book took the argument out of funding. Both together took enough sting from risk that the keel kept biting into new water. That, in the end, is what the pages really purchased. Not glory, not conquest, simply the next hour affordable. When harbors are reached and barrels stacked and a small parade of sea-stained men slouches toward wages, the ledgers have one last task. They must teach memory how to organize itself. In the tavern, the tale grows tall. On the desk, the tale grows square. Later, scholars will pace between these two kinds of story, wondering where the real voyage lived. The answer is annoyingly reasonable. It lived in both, and the biscuits were fine. By now, if you are still with me, and I gently hope you are not, the lantern, as pool of light, has narrowed to a coin. The quill is a quiet animal sleeping in its scratch. A rope above the hatch has decided to creak in the key of D. The captain lowers his head not in prayer or guilt, but in the absent-minded gratitude of a person temporarily done with numbers. The ocean rehearses her vowel. The ledgers are stacked. 2 books, 1 ship, 1 benevolent edit to a planet too wide to be endured without it. If your eyes close, the short leak will keep watch until morning, clocked by a sand glass that, for once, remembers to fall at the correct speed. You probably don't expect a sleepy conversation about how bright a candle should be to last for 3 centuries and involve whales sit velvet-lined boxes and a surprising amount of arguing about shadows, but that is exactly the sort of subject that relaxes historians. A standard candle, they said, should glow with confidence but not ambition, like a polite guest who knows when to leave. That was the dream. The reality was a desk, a scale, and a wick that behaved like a cat. Early clerks weighed tallow as if it were truth itself, shaved wicks with scissors the size of small oars, and wrote things like burned steadily in registers that still smell faintly of smoke. In the corner, a clock ticked just loud enough to remind everyone that time was melting too. A candle for comparison should be pure, they agreed. It should not sputter. It should not sulk in a draught. It should be made from the correct animal, preferably one that did not complain in court. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part where someone invents a device called a photometer, that mainly proved the patience of its owner, feel pleasantly free to subscribe, or don't. The candle will not notice. The first section of this dim little odyssey is made of kitchen work. Tallow was rendered, wicks were twisted. A careful ounce per hour felt like virtue. The rules seemed simple. 1 candle power equals 1 candle doing its job in a very calm room. People love rules that promise calm rooms. Night watchmen liked them. Lighthouse men liked them even more, since ships prefer numbers to adjectives. Somewhere in a chilly counting house, a man in a good hat wrote that a standard must be defined by a mixture that never changed. The trouble with mixtures is that they have hobbies. One batch smoked more, another leaned into romance and flickered at key moments. Some wicks bloomed into little mushrooms of carbon that reduced the flame to a sulking orange. A bored apprentice learned to trim the mushroom off with a tiny pair of tongs. For a while, he was the most powerful person in the photometric world, which is an excellent phrase to whisper if you enjoy startling your sleep. The candle, meanwhile, kept being itself, which is to say it embodied the weather, the maker's breakfast, and the angle of the window 4 streets away. Whale oil appeared with a practical swagger and an ethical blush. Spermaceti burns well, someone said, in the same tone used to compliment a neighbor's lawn. It produced a cleaner flame. Cleaner here means less arguing in the minutes of a committee. Candles made from that wax were the premium subscription of the 18th century. They were pressed in handsome molds, packed in orderly crates, and shipped with a confidence that smelled like the sea. If you wanted your laboratory to feel serious, you lit one and nodded. Sailors had hunted the raw material across calm belts and roaring 40s. a fact never mentioned in the measurement tables because tables prefer not to hear how their numbers were found. In parlors, people read by the light of whales and called it evening. In halls, officials compared two flames to a sheet of white card and called it science. A small device shaped like a polite little seesaw let light tug on both pans until balance was declared. The instrument had a name, of course, but in practice it was always called mine or the good one, and it sat in a velvet-lined box as if it were a ring. It proved to the faint triumph of everyone involved that a well-made candle behaved almost like a unit. Almost is a strong word in photometry. The dreams grew larger. People wanted light with positions behind the decimal point. Shadows were interviewed. Walls were repainted in shades of obedient gray. Black cloths were laid to tame reflections that wandered across a room like cats at a meeting. One scientist suggested an integrating sphere, which, despite sounding philosophical, is simply a hollow white ball that teaches light to average itself. Light does not love being averaged, but the sphere was patient. Another gentleman designed a comparing screen with two slots, one for an unknown lamp and one for the approved candle, creating a little court where brightnesses pleaded their case. A few observers swore they could tell the minute when the candle grew tired. Others insisted that rapport with a flame should not be considered data. The minutes of their society reveal a steady war between adjectives and numbers that ended, like most wars of that kind, with a careful hyphen. Electricity came in humming and unromantic. The carbon arc lamp was brilliant, literally and socially, and far too eager for the quiet business of standards. It hissed like a kettle and made sparks that behaved like gossip. No clerk trusted it, but the incandescent bulb arrived with better manners. Here, at last, was light that could be asked to repeat itself. Filaments, made of materials with elegant names, agreed to glow reproducibly if kindly fed and protected from drafts and opinions. In laboratories, candles retreated into the role of elder statesmen. They were still consulted, but not obeyed. The new standards preferred to be defined in electricity and physics, not kitchen work. A unit called the candela was suggested and, with the inexorable friendliness of a committee, adopted. It translated the old candle power into a number that played well with voltage and radiant intensity. Everyone kept saying candela with mild delight because it sounded like a dessert. And yet the candle lingered in the language like a celebratory crumb on a plate. People asked for 40-watt equivalents, which is not a unit, but a memory. Shopkeepers put lumens on the package and watched buyers squint at the box the way ancestors had squinted at the flame. The modern bulb promised a steady brightness, but kitchens remained drafty and reading chairs continued to invite naps. On lighthouses, the units became as serious as alarms. Lamp keepers wrote figures in logs that were less literary than before, but still secretly proud of their neat columns. The sea looked up, unimpressed, and ships continued to trust beams that cut fog the way patience cuts through a family meeting. By now we can admit a small, pleasing absurdity. Throughout this entire history, people measured candles for the same reasons they measured anything: to assert a quiet dominion over the night and to settle arguments at a distance. A merchant wanted to know that a shipment of lamps would all flatter the same fabric. A city inspector wanted street lighting that reduced the number of people colliding with barrels. A portrait painter wanted a face to look like itself even in January. Behind each desire was the same human wish: make the world repeat itself enough to let us rest. The standard candle was less a flame than a bedtime story that said tomorrow, this room will be bright in the same way as tonight's. It was comforting the way folded laundry is comforting, precise, domestic, ordinary, and somehow heroic. Do not imagine, though, that the actual work felt heroic. Imagine a late 19th century lab after hours. The floorboards remember boots. The blinds are down because daylight is an unhelpful coworker. On the table sits a bar of black velvet, the small throne of the comparing card. Nearby, a book of observations rests with its spine muttering. The operator adjusts the power to an incandescent lamp, nudges a sliding screen until two fields of light appear equal, and then doubts himself for a full minute. He records a number. He blows out the standard candle, as if granting it a wish. He washes the soot from the brass with a cloth damp enough to smell like decisive housekeeping. He thinks about soup. This is the rhythm that built the unit that lives on your light bulb box. Not drama, not revelation. Soup-level perseverance. Occasionally, the history generates a joke that tells on everyone. A town purchased a set of standard candles from a reputable seller and distributed them to its inspectors, only to discover a year later that each box had been made by a different subcontractor with different ideas about wick braiding. The committee assigned to study the calamity produced this sentence: "The candles are not the same." Their report ran 47 pages longer, but that first line was perfect. Another time, a lighthouse claimed that its new lamp met the required candle power, which it did, as long as the measurement was taken on Tuesdays, when the fuel was fresh, and the keeper's nephew, who had the good touch with chimneys, was on duty. These are the micro hooks of applied photometry, delicious as crackers at midnight. There is also the human obstinacy of eyes. People say they see what meters say they should see, but they do not. The eye adapts. It cheats in kind ways. It insists on faces, even in clusters of dots. A laboratory could define 10 candelas with loving care, and a tailor would still ask for just a bit more light, please, because thread can be as shy as a cat. Photometrists learned to both worship and distrust observers. They rotated them, blinded them, fed them, and sometimes bored them into accuracy. The notes are full of phrases like "subject reports flicker at 8 hertz, then recants. The candela, meanwhile, sat in the corner like a good chair. It offered its simple promise and let people's eyes be people's eyes. The metric age convinces many that the story ends in a neat definition printed in a neat book. It does, technically. The candela is anchored in wavelengths and steradians and radiant intensities that sound like tiny marching bands. But daily life preserves a kind untidiness. We say candlelight dinner and mean a temperature of color and, more secretly, a slowness of conversation. We buy warm white lamps because we associate them with butter and holidays. We complain about blue LEDs the way our great-grandparents complained about smoky wicks. When the power goes out and we light an actual candle, we rediscover an adjustable standard called calm. The flame fidgets. The room relaxes. Dishes look theatrical. Dust consents to be pretty. The cat becomes a statue twice as dignified as the civilization that named it. No instrument records this, and none needs to. The unit here is a feeling that says you have time. I like one tiny footnote. Some early experimenters used a candle with a paper shade as a poor person's integrating sphere. They called it the common photometer with a straight face. It half worked. The shade softened the light like a polite aunt softens criticism. It also caught fire, which is the persistent problem with light in the form of flame. Still, it let shopkeepers compare window lamps without leaving the counter. It was a standard with a sense of humor. Standards with senses of humor are underrated. If you peer at modern data sheets, you'll see plots of intensity by angle, neat petals of brightness that could be flowers in a sensible garden. The candle's descendants perform in these graphs with admirable discipline. They tell you exactly how bright the kitchen will be if the fixture is placed where the architect says. You read these charts, nod, and then install the lamp 2 feet to the left because the table looks happier there. The difference between the graph and your choice is where the standard candle still quietly burns. It reminds you that units live to serve rooms, not rooms to serve units. There are, of course, places where none of this is faintly funny. Operating rooms, runways, tunnels, and ships rely on light that obeys contracts. There, the candela is stern. It sets minimums, it produces audits. It keeps the night from swallowing information. Even there, though, someone tests a lamp and says, "That looks right." And the sentence carries a thread back to a tallow candle that sputtered in a committee room and was forgiven because everyone wanted to go home. As we drift to the soft end of things, consider the humblest legacy of the standard candle. The way it taught people to look and then look again. To trim, to wait for the draft to decide, to average while admitting you were averaging. It turned a room into a patient. It gave clerks something useful to fuss over. It even gave poets an excuse to use the word guttering without scaring anyone. The candle never asked for this career. It only set its wax to melting and performed brightness until told to stop. If your eyes are closing now, you are measuring the oldest photometric quantity we have, enough. The room is likely lit by a machine that could quote its lumens with 2 decimal places. None of that matters to the cat on the chair or the book on your chest or the list in your head that has agreed, just for a little while, to be postponed. Somewhere in a museum sits a velvet-lined box containing a photometer that once compared a brave new lamp to a well-behaved candle. You could open the lid and still smell both ambition and soot. The needle would twitch, then rest. The standard would nod to the unknown and say, in the fluent language of bedtime science, that this is as bright as we need and no brighter. You might not expect the angle of a paper flap to shape office life for a century, yet here we are, leaning over a rectangle and wondering which side is the polite one. The envelope is confident about its shape, but shy about its history. It begins as a rumor of a fold, then becomes a crease you can feel with your fingertip. Early clerks folded letters into their own wrappers and sealed the folds with wax, which was reliable in the same way a sleepy dog is reliable, affectionate but inclined to wonder. A fold that slipped could betray a sentence to the street. So people looked at paper and imagined a separate skin for the words, a jacket for correspondence, a coat for thoughts. They tried triangles. They tried squares. They tried a fold that looked like a windmill at rest. Someone suggested a tuck that needed no seal at all, and everyone agreed it was clever until the wind disagreed. If you are somehow still awake when we reach the clause about the minimum gum thickness, required by a certain post office in 1897, you may subscribe or continue floating in this comfortable bureaucracy without lifting a finger. The envelope will not mind. It has a flap to think about. Paper had to learn how to be calm. Rag paper was excellent at it because old shirts already knew the discipline of being handled. Pulp paper was excitable at first. It curled when it met damp air and bragged about fibers that pointed in different directions, like a conversation with too many cousins. So the trade developed the quiet notion of grain. Fold with the grain and the crease behaves like a hinge. Fold against it and the paper throws a small tantrum. Making envelopes in quantity required a truce with grain. The machines learned to cut long rectangles so that each would accept a fold without complaint. The operators learned to keep their hands slightly dusty because clean fingers stick to gum and nobody wanted gum on the rollers. A roll of paper unspooled across a room with the composure of a train timetable and a die sharp as grammar punched shapes that looked like elongated butterflies. A worker could hold one up to the light and see, in the translucent belly, the promise of a tidy life for a letter. It is very hard to remain anxious while a stack of future envelopes is aligning itself by gravity. The flap argues with geometry in a low voice. There were 3 main dialects. The pointed flap, beloved by stationers who liked romance, met in a soft dagger that felt appropriate for wedding invitations and confessions that might become literature. The rounded flap, which paper catalogs praised as comforting, allowed the hand to glide and whispered nothing at all about the contents. The square or banker's flap was a ruler pretending to be a smile. It promised business. It promised that whoever opened it would find numbers and endure them. Behind the flaps, you had the body of the thing and body's required sizes. Before standardization, a letter could arrive in an envelope that seemed to have been designed for a map or possibly a small tablecloth. Offices kept drawers of odd sizes and named them by accident: monarch, baronial, invitation, executive, commercial. The names clung like old cologne. When printers began to love the number 10, a memorable rectangle emerged. A long envelope that allowed a letter folded in 3 to slide in like a patient ship entering a harbor with tugboats. Mel, 10, had the lazily perfect proportions that make standards feel inevitable in hindsight. It was tall enough to take a slogan without boasting. It was long enough to give the stamp some room to breathe. Sealing required chemistry that would not scare grandmothers. The first gums were natural and sticky with the same innocent ambition as jam. A pot simmered, a wooden paddle turned. A man in a vest decided a viscosity with the authority of a weather report. The gum strip was brushed on a modest river. It dried to a shine that experienced clerks could diagnose by sound. Tap the flap with a fingernail and listen for the respectable, glassy tick that says the envelope has learned patience. Too thin, and the flap behaves like a rumor. Too thick, and stacks weld themselves together overnight. People licked with varying enthusiasm. Some lickers claimed they could identify makers by flavor. Some refused and used sponges that looked like domesticated sea creatures. In winter, water froze in the sponge and letters waited for the kettle. One meeting in 1902 spent entirely too long on whether mint flavor would increase efficiency. It did not, let the minutes record general good feeling. The Postal Service liked envelopes because envelopes behaved. A letter in an envelope could be sorted by machine fingers without asking the clerk to apologize for wax, thread, or odd bulges that might be pastry. Perforations were practiced on stamps, then considered for envelope flaps, but rejected as too exuberant. Instead, the machines learned to like smoothness. They preferred the stamp in the upper right because hands prefer patterns. They preferred addresses written low enough to avoid the machine's appetite for white space along the top. Every preference became a rule. Every rule became a pamphlet, and every pamphlet became a quiet part of life. The address block grew into a cultural object as unassuming and specific as a teacup. Name, line, code. An envelope without this block is like a cat without a plan beautiful, but not going anywhere. Windows came later, and they were considered almost scandalous at first. The idea was undeniable. Print the address on the letter itself and let it peek through, reducing errors and saving clerks from carbon paper. Yet a hole in an envelope struck many as an immodesty. Early windows used a cellophane that held static like a grudge. It clung to sleeves. It collected dust and opinions. It wrinkled in summer and hummed in winter. But it let factories send bills with the address aligned like a planet. A new ritual appeared. Fold the letter so the name shows in the window. Tap the stack to settle gravity's nerves. If the name slides out of view, adjust. This was the choreography of a civilization that loves rectangles. Window positions became coordinates with names. Single window, double window, left or right. Sometimes a tiny porthole for a return address that winked like a secret. The window envelope taught the world that paper could have purpose built into the skin. Etiquette, never far from stationary, contributed rules with the politest insistence. If the flap points down, the invitation is formal. If it points sideways, we're cozier than that. Black-edged envelopes signaled mourning with a border that allowed sorrow to be publicly tidy. Heavy stock suggests importance. Thin stock suggests haste. Blue tissue liners made letters feel like winter and also kept curious light from reading the page before it should. Wax seals retreated to special occasions and became ornamental, sometimes declaring initials that looked more like vines than letters. Even the tilt of the stamp grew folklore. People placed it straight for business, at a jaunty angle for affection, upside down for coded sentiment that postal workers pretended not to notice. Nothing proves humanity's desire to complicate the simple like a rectangle designed to be opened. Reusability was a quiet hobby. In austere times, careful people opened envelopes with steam and inverted them, then resealed the clean back as the new front. The ghost of the old address wandered like a memory under fresh ink. Around desks, one still finds knives designed for the intimacy of opening. A good letter opener has the manners of a museum guard, present, alert, almost invisible. It slides under the flap and asks nothing else. Some prefer tearing, of course. Tearing has its satisfactions, but a torn envelope asks the question, why rush? And is not always answered. Offices bought spring-loaded slitters that ate one edge neatly and produced ribbons of paper like confetti from a very subdued party. Somewhere, a museum possesses a glass jar filled with these pale streamers, labeled only evidence of correspondence. Machines for making envelopes grew into slick arrangements of belts and suckers. A stack of die-cut blanks lay at one end like obedient leaves. A mouth of rollers licked each flap with a measured sigh. Metal fingers folded two sides in, bottom up, top down, the way a parent folds a blanket. The finished envelopes shingled into heaps with the same deeply satisfying alignment as new roof tiles. Operators tuned the line like an instrument. Too much suction and the blanks arrived two at a time, which is the paper equivalent of a polite crash. Too little, and the machine paused to consider its life. The sound of a well-set envelope line is the heartbeat of bureaucracy. A soft thump, a whisk, a small hiss, repeated at a tempo that melts minutes. Standard sizes made the world seem domesticated. C5 took an A4 folded in half. DL took an A4 folded in thirds. These facts sit in the brain like the multiplication table you learned while staring out a window. In North America, the no 10 reigned, and smaller siblings bustled around it. No, 9 for reply, like a child holding a parent's hand. 6 3/4 for checks. 6 3/8 for those who enjoyed fractions at the office. Catalog envelopes, large and patient, demanded their flaps on the shorter side open at the end, like a mouth prepared to tell the truth. People sorted by color too, manila for work, white for both work and everything pretending not to be, gray for government, soft pastels for hope. A quarter ream of envelopes sits on a supply shelf like a promise that the day will continue to have an average number of events. A minor but persistent question was whether to preprint return addresses. The thrifty said rubber stamps were enough. The proud said preprinting saved time, ink, and embarrassment. The cautious pointed out that moving offices turns envelopes into fossils. Printing chose a sigh and offered packages. Top left corner, small caps, a neat line between street and city that looked like a horizon you could trust. On advertising pieces, envelopes took to wearing slogans. Important information enclosed, they announced, attempting to persuade the reader that the rectangle had feelings. Courts occasionally decided how much truth an envelope should contain. Final notice is not final if more notices are planned, said one judge who was probably very kind in person. Security tents, those patterns inside that look like tiny fishing nets, entered like wallpaper in a rented room and never left. Printers chose designs that confused the casual glance. Squares, spirals, hatchings that resembled snow when seen from a train. The tents turned an ordinary envelope into a modest fortress. Paired with the humble miracle of gummed side seams, they made privacy a default rather than a luxury. If you hold such an envelope up to the light and see merely a blue whisper, you are witnessing the triumph of small patterns over nosy photons. It is a pleasant triumph. It makes no speeches. There are also the little errors that keep the topic human. Someone somewhere will always address an envelope upside down. The stamp will hover near the lower left like an adventurous moth. A window will frame the salutation instead of the address. sending a friendly, "Dear Miss Harper," to the sorting machine, which cannot answer. Glue will fail at the exact moment an important check commits to the mail stream, and a vigilant clerk with a roll of tape will become a legend for an afternoon. These mishaps prove that systems exist not to eliminate mistakes, but to keep them sweet and survivable. Envelopes teach hands to be considerate. How to align corners, how to press a seal without bruising it, how to stack a pile so that edges don't scissor the skin. They train eyes to find the postal code, which is the music of location written without melody. They give conversations a costume. The outside carries the plainclothes of the world. The inside holds the voice that didn't want to shout. A child learns to send a drawing to a grandparent and learns at the same time how to write a home on a small canvas. The discipline of a little rectangle becomes a first geometry of belonging. Digital life didn't retire envelopes. It changed their job descriptions. Bills left. Invitations stayed. Paper grew ceremonial. The good rag stocks returned, and with them the fondness for pointed flaps that behave like a nod. Ink colors ventured beyond sensible blues. Deep green suggested a careful garden party. Eggplant persuaded the eye that the message might be unusually kind. Wax seals made a comeback with kits that promised you the small, imperial feeling of pressing authority into a circle. Mail carriers, masters of the ordinary, delivered these with the same steady gait they used for water bills. Ceremony and routine shared a pocket. You can still find machines that open mail by the hundred because organizations believe in envelopes the way bakers believe in flour. Inside those organizations, there is usually one person who cares about the grain of the paper and keeps a spare sponge in a desk drawer, although nobody licks anymore. Ask that person about the best way to hold a stack for sealing, and you will be shown a grip that prevents wrist fatigue, as if the job were an instrument to be played. This is because it is. Occasionally, a museum mounts a display of envelopes addressed to famous people. The handwriting ranges from terrified to jubilant. Some writers made astonishing use of available space, including clear instructions about which doorbell to ring, as if the post could do that too. You trace the path of the stamp cancellations and find an itinerary as fussy and brave as any voyage. If you watch long enough, the glass over the display begins to reflect the room, and you see yourself, another addressee without an address, basking in the serenity of good paper. If there is a thesis to this comfortingly minor subject, it is that the rectangle you hold has more thought in it than it admits. Angles were argued, gums were measured, windows were doubted and then adopted. Sizes were named, renamed, and finally allowed to be numbers. The result sits on a counter, waiting for an address that recognizes a person by the way a city and a street meet. The waiting is part of the design. Envelopes are patient even when people are not. They lie flat. They stack. They do not insist. When the day is quiet, take one from the box and open it without a purpose. Feel the calm weight. Notice the 3 seams along the back where industry hides. Touch the gum that asks only for a breath of water. Fold a blank sheet into thirds by letting the paper find its own thirds. No rulers, just the remembered intelligence of pulp and grain. Slide the sheet inside. The fit is the secret handshake of 2 inventions that learn to be friends. Address it to somewhere imaginary. Add a stamp you like for reasons you can't defend. Then place the envelope back into the drawer, unmailed and perfect. A small rehearsal for messages that will matter less than you think and more than you know. The flap rests. The rectangle waits. The night grows a fraction tidier. You might not expect the size of a small rectangle to change how people think, but the index card has always been smug about this. It is a modest stage with strict dimensions, a piece of paper that believes in boundaries. Hold one and you immediately behave a little better. You stop trying to summarize the universe and settle for what fits between the corners. Librarians like that about it. So did botanists with pockets and historians who packed their thoughts like traveling socks. Early students used scraps, old envelopes, anything flat. Then someone cut paper to a size that made thoughts behave. 3 by 5 inches, or sometimes 4 by 6 if the ambition required a nap. The card could take ink without running away, could be shuffled, could fall to the floor and still be found, which is more than can be said of certain brilliant ideas. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe to this ongoing archive of nearly nothing, or don't. The cards will remain agreeable either way, quietly stacked, the same today as yesterday. The first scene is a desk with a box that pretends to be a drawer. The lid slides back with the hush of an elevator arriving at a very polite floor. Inside are cards in a pale, dependable color, cream the shade of waiting. The cardstock is stiff enough to object to a careless bend, soft enough to accept a pencil without a fight. There is a ruling in faint blue, as though the manufacturer doesn't want to embarrass your handwriting. Some packs have a red line on top, a gesture that says, "Title me if you must." 19th century scholars sitting under oil lamps learned that a thought written on a sheet invites a paragraph. A thought written on a card chooses a sentence, perhaps two, and then refuses more. A card does not say stop exactly, but it clears its throat. You can see the appeal for anyone who has tried to explain anything while the kettle boils. Librarians are the patron saints of this rectangle. The card catalog began as a vocal habit. The stack whispered to you where a book lived. Each card measured a book's identity with the gravity of a passport: author, title, subject, a call number that looked like coordinates for a comb voyage. Someone, somewhere, standardized the placement of every piece of information so that any hand could find it in any drawer. Drawers multiplied. They arrived in honey-colored cabinets with handles that invited 3 fingers. The tiny brass frames took typed labels with an optimism that never dimmed. People learned to walk with a specific rhythm when they approached a catalog, a step that expects discovery without drama. The cards were cut with deliberate corners and punched with a neat hole near the bottom, so a metal rod could run through and prevent the chaos of exuberant browsing. It was a very gentle prison. Typists fed cards into machines and made tidy rows of letters that stood like a row of houses after a municipal decree. The typewriter ribbon pressed truth into fibers. Carbon copies existed briefly as a concept, then politely excused themselves when everyone agreed that 1 card per thought was plenty. Catalogers practiced the art of small decisions. Is a book filed under an author's surname or the committee that sponsored the report? Should a hyphen count? The card, untroubled, accepted any answer as long as it was consistent. That was the deal. Consistency is the quietest revolution. Cards escape the library because scientists are magpies with lab coats. Biologists carried field cards into meadows and wrote the date, the weather, the exact sulk of a cloud. The card lay on a knee and stayed flat. In the lab, growing rows of index cards formed a second growth of thinking, a papery understory. Economists found they could gather statistics not as a monolith, but as a collection of small, stackable facts. A misplaced card represented a missing percentage point, which was satisfying in its proportional grief. Botanists pinned petals to cards with such reverence that the cards smelled faintly of dried light. A paleontologist wrote tooth fragment, probably mammal, too shy to specify, and slid the card into the M section like a letter to a future self. Every discipline developed a handwriting that could be recognized across a room. Ornithologists wrote in strokes that landed like birds. Sociologists favored tidy, coaxing letters that ask questions even when stating facts. Scene 2 opens with a hand hovering over a stack and, without being dramatic, wondering which card goes first. Order is the daydream of index cards. The alphabet is a safe default. Chronology is attractive because it keeps you from arguing. that the seductive jewel here is the idea of a subject, a word that fixes a card to others by invisible thread. People invented descriptor, a term that sounds like a mechanical bird and is just as helpful. Descriptors let you collect thoughts from different years and marry them calmly under the same heading. If you ever watch a scholar refile a card, you see the small choreography of reconciliation, as though the card has been gently corrected and thanks you. Dividers entered this universe like a good door policy. They are slightly taller, sometimes with little ears called tabs. Tabs have personalities and understand the need to be both noticeable and humble. A tab that shouts will bully the cards. Behind it, a tab that whispers will cause the user to age prematurely. People wrote letters on the tabs with thick pencils, then later switched to labels when their handwriting began to look like weather. Labeled dividers experience fewer existential crises. We owe them that there are failures in this paper world, which is how it stays human. A coffee ring becomes a permanent hypothesis. A card written in fountain pen meets an unexpected drizzle and takes up impressionism. Someone files a note about roads, Roma, potholes, under P, and feels correct until regret arrives with the afternoon. These are gentle errors, the soft laughter of the filing universe. The cards wait for you to try again. They do not expire. They only become a little more historical. There is a sound to this activity. It is quieter than shuffling a deck, louder than thinking. Cards click when squared. They whisper when separated. When you hold a stack, the thumb glides along the cut edges as if petting a very tidy animal. You put them into their box and feel a little better because the day has a lid again. If organization contains a moral, it is a soft one that usefulness can be small and still be enormous. Some people keep a daily card and date it. A humble calendar that values the sensation of finishing one rectangle and starting another. On the shelf, these cards become a new unit of memory, not days or months, but thickness. You measure the year by a thumb's worth. This has the advantage of being more physical and therefore more truthful. What did you do in April? You produced 8 millimeters of observations. Excellent. Some days have only half a millimeter. Also excellent. The card accepts both verdicts without editorializing. Manufacturers, perhaps skeptical of romance, still argue about the best cardstock weight. 60-pound stock bends well and floats. 80-pound stock behaves like an opinion. Some swear by blank cards for pure freedom. Others insist on ruling because writing should march like a parade. Dot grid cards arrive and softly take over the middle ground, a meadow of points that let you pretend you aren't being guided. The choice becomes a declaration in miniature. Ask someone about their preferred card and you will learn where they sit. Between chaos and him dot, there are index cards and attics that hold the elderly breath of ideas. A grandfather's box labeled projects contains 4 tabs. Shed, pump, taxes, boat. Under boat, there's exactly 1 card. Find a boat. This is either a joke or a very ambitious plan. A painter leaves notes about colors that are now discontinued, and the cards become a museum of pigments that enjoyed their moment. A teacher's cards show the seasons of a mind. September full of intentions. Late May dense with small victories like everyone mastered the semicolon. Miracle noted. The boxes do not resent being left alone for years. They are the opposite of impatient dot index cards, encourage you to write privately. Knowing the audience is a future you who may disagree but will forgive. 1 card says, apologize to M for the thing with the ladder, and the drawer it sits in does not leak that secret to anyone. Another card keeps a grocery list that teaches you about your household in a forensic way. The repeating crave for lemons, the loyalty to a certain tea, the season when everyone pretended to like kale. You begin to understand that stationery can be a biography conducted in whispers. We should admit a tiny danger. The box can become a proxy for the work. And sometimes people polish dividers when they meant to polish prose. The card understands and does not intervene. Instead, it waits a respectable interval and presents itself again as a rectangle that can hold exactly one idea. It asks you to write that idea down, nothing more, then file it somewhere that makes sense for at least an afternoon. The system rewards modesty. Ambition can come later with a rubber band. Imagine, for sleep's sake, the world seen from the perspective of a card catalog in the evening. The building is empty. The drawers lounge slightly open like mouths mid-sentence. Dust travels in diplomatic lines across the air. Somewhere a radiator rehearses an old aria. Between two cards in the W drawer, one corner presses the other with a pressure that contains every reference to water, wave, wind, winter. This pressure is not urgent. It is simply the etiquette of being filed. It is the opposite of chaos. It is a lullaby for anyone whose thoughts have been loud dot, and now the night expands to the size of a tabletop, where a small box waits. You slide open the lid and there is a card on top that you forgot you wrote. Index cards are proof that thinking benefits from edges. It is too much and just enough. You move it behind a divider and label the divider edges, because you can, and because a unit of filing invents its own category. The sound of the lid closing is a soft consonant. The room, pleased by the geometry, lowers its shoulders. Somewhere the box of cards in someone else's room makes the same sound, and neither of you knows, but both feel the faint improvement. If there's a moral worth whispering to sleep, it's that the smallest shapes carry the kindest authority. The card does not scold your paragraphs. It does not compete with the screen. It sits there asking for a sentence that can stand alone. Hand it a date, a line, a notion. Give it something you hope to remember but don't want to chase. Then slide it into a small crowd of similar hopes. The crowd takes care of its own. The box closes. The drawer returns to its snug interior weather. Thoughts, feeling sheltered, stop rehearsing and begin to rest. And the cards keep their little watch, tidy and patient, until the morning opens them again. Manufacturers learned to make the cards cooperative. Grain direction mattered the way a stack bends. A correct grain lets a thumb flick the edge as one would briskly turn pages of a very quiet book. The stock thickness tells the intention. The thin card implies exploration. The thick card implies certainty, or at least the feeling of a hill you are prepared to stand on. Colors crept in. Pale green for sources, yellow for quotes, blue for ideas, rose for figures. The systematics of an individual mind become a private weather. Someone could glance at a shoebox and tell you this is a person who is hopeful about footnotes. On certain desks, cards lived in rotary files, devices with a crank that made contacts spin like a small planet. These were the address books of determined people. Every turn produced a name, a number, and a low mechanical sound that encouraged the making of phone calls you did not want to make, but now would. The flip of a Roland or a Rolodex names themselves with the physics of rotation inside them was ceremonial. Business cards were too small, too eager. Index cards felt sturdier, as if you could borrow their calm. The third scene is a hand annotating a card with a pencil chewed to a point. That could be called optimistic. Short sentences populate the lines like good neighbors. Writers love this. A novel could begin as an unruly flock and become cards perched on a string. You could shuffle a chapter into a new order simply by admitting that a character needed to arrive 2 cards earlier. Historians built castles of evidence this way: quotation on one card, citation on the next, interpretation on a third. They drafted arguments on the floor because floors rarely collapse and are good listeners. A well-behaved dog could be trusted to step carefully between piles. A cat could not, which is why many footnotes include traces of despair. Most card boxes live in the middle scale between pocket and cabinet. the cigar box size that suggests seriousness but not bureaucracy. Some slide open with shoebox energy. Others have a domesticated draw of a little drawer with a finger cut out like a smile. One especially persuasive design includes a sprung follower block that pushes the cards forward as you remove them, maintaining the illusion that the stash is infinite. It is always encouraging when furniture believes in you. Students invented rituals around cards. A card for each source, a card per lecture, a sequence of cards for an exam that whisper the future in manageable increments. They decorated edges with color pencils, like flags on a paper frontier. The repetition felt like work and therefore felt like achievement. One card per day made a stack, and a stack turned into the sense that knowledge is a friendly accumulation rather than a booby trap. Teachers carried little stacks bound with rubber bands that aged faster than they did. The bands snapped in meeting rooms with a sound like a tiny judgment. Everyone pretended not to notice that companies developed supplies with evangelical confidence. There were boxes with locking lids in case of drafts. There were pocket cases for field notes with a slot for a pencil that agreed to live with such smallness. There were cards pre-printed with forms so ubiquitous they became invisible. Date, subject, action. At least 2 firms proudly marketed waterproof index cards for people who think in the rain. Field researchers bought them and then forgot to test the rain part, which is typical. A very serious chemist once designed a card rolled in millimeters just for drawing reaction setups. The card is now a relic of a way of seeing. When computers appeared, cards stood quietly to one side and waited to be dismissed. They weren't. Instead, they shifted from main stage to rehearsal room. Digital search did what card catalogs did, only faster. The cards turned into the place where thoughts get their shoes on. Programmers even borrowed the metaphor and created virtual cards on screens, which proves that the shape had already carved a groove in the mind. Many people learned that the health of a project could be measured by the health of its cards. A scoop-headed stack means momentum. A scattering across the rug means you are building a wind-dependent theory. Both are fine. The card is non-judgmental. Our last scene is a long evening, the kind that encourages an honest sort of bookkeeping. A person decides to sort everything again for the pleasure of knowing where things might be. They set up a little runway on the table and move cards like seasons. It is soothing. You cannot argue with the alphabet or the calendar. You can only adopt their moods. A stray card appears. Pencil hardness. HB is democracy. 2H is ambition. You smile at your past self, who is funnier than the situation required. Another card announces a book title you meant to read 3 years ago. A third holds the recipe for a rare soup that requires a certain herb. No market has carried since 2011. Every card is a small truce with time. You might not expect a little glass bulb full of sand to be an authority, but hourglasses have been telling people what to do for so long that even the sand has opinions. An hourglass does not argue. It descends. It is the opposite of suspense. It simply continues, one patient grain at a time, as if the universe could be poured. In workshops where light came as a square on the floor, apprentices learn that time, to be tolerated, must be divided into small, obedient avalanches. A wooden frame, 2 bulbs, a narrow throat, and suddenly there is a sip-sized portion of forever. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe, or let the grains keep falling and pretend you did. The glass will not check. On a table of scuffs and quietly heroic glue, a glass blower rolls a bubble on the iron, turning slowly enough that the workshop's dog falls asleep mid-wag. Heat brightens the bubble to the color of a respectable sunset. The maker blows once, then again, shaping a globe that has ambitions to become 2. A thin bridge forms, what experts call the waste and romantics call the hour. While the glass is still warm and persuadable, the worker pulls it gently, so the bridge narrows to a whisper. The best throats are neither stingy nor indulgent. A stingy throat will teach the sand to sulk and clump. An indulgent throat will let time run away like a child at a fair. The art is not magic. It is persuasion. You coax glass into a truce with gravity. Sand is not always sand. In good shops, it is crushed marble or powdered eggshell or pounded marble, mixed with burnt eggshell and a secret handful of ground lead that keeps scholars writing letters about health. Sailors prefer a heavier mixture that doesn't flinch when the sea takes offense. Monks like fine silica roasted in brick ovens until it flows like winter wheat. Whatever the recipe, it is sifted through screens whose holes have personalities. Coarse mesh is a cheerful uncle. Fine mesh is a lawyer. The grains learn to be uniform by the simple pressure of rejection. Those that slip through earn a job measuring soup, sermons, and shifts. Once the bulbs are joined and the wooden collars fitted, testing begins. A rope is knotted where the light falls at mid-morning. The glass is turned. Someone counts quietly to 60 times, with a piece of charcoal ready to confess every result on a margin of the bench. The first run is too quick because the sand is shy and leaves gaps. The second run is slower because the grains have moved in together and are conducting their little society. The third run, for reasons even philosophers accept, is closest to honest. This is how an hour is born into a household. If it is a half hour, a quarter hour, a miserly 2-minute egg, the process is the same, just scaled to a different personality. Every glass acquires a reputation like a neighbor. This one is brisk in damp weather, that one likes sun. There are tricks for weather. If the day is humid, the maker stirs a pinch of ground clove or whispering rice into the sand, then tells nobody because trade secrets are spices. For journeying glasses, a few goose feather fibers calm static. A sailor will rub the neck with a waxy rag and swear at it in a language that has more words for wind than for politeness. And the glass will reward this devotion by behaving. The one thing everyone agrees on is to avoid breath near the waist. A sigh will slow an hour by a small but socially important amount. In monasteries, novices learn to turn the glass with their mouth closed, which is a lesson disguised as a technique. Shops invent small rituals because rituals are glue. The first turn of a newly made glass is done with 2 hands, like meeting an old person who knows your future. The frame is decorated with hash marks you can trust with the back of your eye. Some frames show a notch that no one admits to cutting. That is the maker's signature, sober as a cleric, secret as a grin. In the ledger, the glass receives a name, not poetic, just clear. 30-minute, 3rd of autumn. Occasionally, a customer returns one and says it listens too closely to the moon. The maker nods and narrows the throat with a heated wire, while telling a story about a customer who once tried to fix an hourglass with a spoon. The moral is that spoons are for soup. The glass goes out into the world, which is mainly tables. In a kitchen, it governs the tenderness of eggs and the honesty of tea. The cook learns the tilt that makes the last grain hurry like a child visiting cake. In workshops, it rations tasks. 10 minutes to plane a stubborn board, 30 to let glue reconsider its life choices. Philosophers perform experiments that consist of turning the glass and sitting very still. They develop theories that are absolutely true for as long as the sand falls. A mathematician, lacking paper, uses the glass to prove that certainty can be timed. The proof vanishes when the glass is turned, which is exactly the kind of elegance mathematicians crave. Sailors adopt the glass with the practicality of people who dislike drowning. An hour at sea is an elastic thing unless you persuade it with sand. The watch bell rings every time the glass lies down empty, which means a day at sea has 8 quiet ceremonies. The bell's pattern becomes a language that tells a sleeper whether he has 5 minutes more to dream of bread. In fog, the glass feels like a friend who is good at waiting. When the ship climbs water hills, the sand moves in tiny waves of its own, a sea within a sea, and any person who stares at it too long learns that motion can be soothing if it is very small. On church pulpits, the glass keeps sermons from becoming folk tales. It sits beside a Bible like a dog trained to cough politely. The preacher learns to turn the glass with a rhythm that makes parishioners think kindly of eternity. If a sermon needs 2 glasses, it usually does not, but the congregation will allow it on feast days. During Lent, certain towns have a rule that a homily may not exceed 1 glass because repentance is energetic only for so long. Children race the sand with their blinks and always lose, which is how they begin to honor time without fear. Some pews contain people who study the glass instead of heaven and decide that both are fine in courtrooms. The glass appears as an accessory to patience. Lawyers learn the habit of speaking in grains. A well-practiced pause consumes 5 seconds of sand, which is measurable dignity. The judge owns a 30-minute glass that sits like a second gavel. When the glass is turned for deliberations, everyone stands a little straighter because they can see the precise size of their own eloquence. Juries appreciate this. So do clerks who value a day that feels like a shoot. Not all glasses are content. There is the dramatic one on the desk of a city tax official who enjoys turning it when citizens request leniency. There is the tiny 2-minute glass in a dentist's office that makes tides of mint. There are theatrical glasses that pretend to measure a villain's fate while backstage a stagehand with a pinhole accelerates justice. And there is the glass in a school that times recitations in Latin and produces a miraculous correlation between ablative absolute and the encouragement of yawns. Education learns that 2 turns are useful for memorization, the first to stare, the second to pretend to stare. A repairman appears in this story because hourglasses are domesticated but not tame. The repairman travels with a small kit of sieves, wires, and a jar labeled polite sand. He arrives with the neutrality of a guest who will fix a hinge. Customers explain their theories. It is the weather. It is the cat. It is the mood of Thursdays. The repairman listens, nods, warms the neck with a lamp, and introduces a thread-like file to rake up the throat. He adds a whisper of graphite or removes 2 overly ambitious grains. He replaces the stopper with a cork that behaves. Then he performs the liturgy of testing, which includes turning the glass 3 times and declining tea twice. The fee is reasonable because time is a volume and he only adjusted a teaspoon. Sometimes a glass breaks. The sound is not sharp but apologetic. A bulb cracks just enough to create a wind that changes the fall. People try to tape the wound because tape seduces the modernization impulse. But tape has opinions about glass, and they are not kind. Fragments become ornaments in drawers. The sand escapes onto floors and obeys the ancient law of marital disagreement. It goes everywhere quietly. Children learn that sweeping up time is both impossible and calming. Someone keeps a pinch of the spilled sand in a salt spoon with the notion that it may help with soup. It does not, but the idea remains pleasant. There are city workshops where the hourglass becomes administrative. Municipal clerks time visits. Printers measure the length of an ink rest between impressions so that grays do not argue with blacks. A pharmacist uses a 30-second glass to count heartbeats when the watch fails, which it does under certain moods of patients who do not like tickings. A barber shaves by the glass so that customers cannot claim an extra minute of razor music. In every case, the hourglass imposes a gentle fairness. No glass is longer, for the handsome dot lectures quietly depend on the glass, even as everyone insists they do not. A lecturer says he will speak briefly and places a glass in view, a theater prop that calms the anxious. He glances at it when an anecdote becomes sociable. Students track the descending cone of sand and discover that attention is granular. You can concentrate for 180 grains, Then you must drift for 12 grains. Then you can return for another 100. It's a neurological accordion, and the glass, who has seen everything, does not mind. Night work invents new uses. In watchmakers' rooms, minute glasses slice time into pieces that fit under loupe magnification. In kitchens after sunset, cooks learn the rhythm of sauces that need exactly a coffee's worth of patience. The hourglass whispers across professions, "Do this until I finish, then rest until I begin." The command is small and kind. It respects the human spine, which appreciates tasks with edges. We arrive at a scene where an hourglass sits on a mantle as ornament, retired from ordnance. People assume it is purely decorative, like a portrait of an ancestor with excellent shoulders. But even retired glasses emit the faint authority of schedule. The household unconsciously measures an evening by the number of times someone turns the glass in passing. Visitors do not notice until they pour their stories into that rhythm and discover they have told exactly one glass of weather and half a glass of travel. Someone jokes that the dessert should be served when the sand is half gone. The glass agrees. In this way, the room grows orderly without rules. A museum collects hourglasses and discovers that labels like Italy C1620 are less interesting than notes like used for boiling turnips. The turnip timer has a handle worn smooth by damp fingers. The museum does not polish it because patina is time's autograph. Another glass once lived on a lighthouse desk and is permanently tilted, a biography in its posture. A third arrived with sand the color of parlor wallpaper and refuses to fall in clumps, as though it remembers domestic constraints. The docents learn to turn each glass exactly once a week to keep the sand friendly. There is no official reason. It simply seems polite. Modernity does not abolish the hourglass. It gives it new costumes. Coffee shops use tiny glasses to persuade water to court beans. Therapists place a 5-minute glass on the table for exercises that need a boundary but no electricity. Digital app designers draw hourglasses on screens and name the spinning symbols after them, hoping to borrow the authority of waiting. Somewhere a programmer owns a real one, turns it, and discovers that debugging belongs to a fall of grains rather than a burst of keys. Time as software returns to time as furniture. In kitchens where children live, the hourglass becomes currency. 2 turns before bed, says a parent whose politics are rooted in bedtime. The children learn to bargain, 1 more turn for teeth. Teeth accept the compromise. A glass in the bathroom measures the honest length of hand washing in a way the faucet respects. In hallways, siblings race the sand with recitations of capitals or planets. The cards keep changing, but the glass stays the referee. It is the one object that never raises its voice. Travelers discover that hourglasses cross borders better than plugs. In trains, a pocket glass makes a private hour in a public chair. In hotel rooms, where clocks often display opinions about time zones, the hourglass makes tea cooperative and jet lag less theatrical. A person who turns a glass in a new place learns that the first thing we do to own a room is schedule it a little. This is a domestic magic that requires no batteries, only gravity, which you were already carrying. There is a graceful failure that only hourglasses can perform. Occasionally, the last grain pauses at the throat like a shy actor before a line. 2 more grains pile behind it, and the tiny arch holds. You are allowed 1 elegant tap on the frame. The arch collapses with gratitude. This teaches patience that is neither stubborn nor fussy. It is the patience of tapping once. Some people need this lesson more than others. The glass does not keep score. Across centuries, professionals argued over calibration. How long is an hourglass hour? In some towns, a glass might run a shade fast, so that market haggling ends before tempers begin. In others, it runs slow to keep conversation warm. Ships issued sets of glasses and compared them against noon, which is the only time the sun sets for a portrait. A paradox emerged. The better you calibrate an hourglass, the more you notice the hours you do not need. This is why the best glasses live in quiet rooms and time things that do not mind. Collectors name their glasses. This is a confidential habit. One glass is called the patient because it falls evenly even when the window is open. Another is the stingy because it hoards grains at the end and then lets them go in a tiny clatter. A third is the optimist because it stands a little taller than its function and makes a half hour feel like a promise. Visitors hear these names and assume the collector is sentimental. The collector smiles and turns the patient. Naming is how we agree to look after things. There is an odd, pleasing economics to hourglasses. You cannot borrow minutes from the next fall or ask for change. A glass cannot be shaken into generosity without becoming disappointing. It is that rare tool that resists urgency. You decide what to pour it over. Conversation, chores, rest. Once chosen, the event receives a boundary and relaxes, like soup in a bowl. Productivity experts rediscovered this and gave it a tomato nickname. Our ancestors had already done the experiment with fewer metaphors and more eggs dot by now. The workshop has grown quiet. The maker cleans the chimney of the lamp and writes down the day's calibrations, which read like a weather report for sand. Outside, neighbors guess the hour by the tone of footsteps returning along the lane, which is a clock older than glass. The last task is to turn a shop glass that measures sweeping. It sits in the doorway and watches dust become intentional. When the final grain falls, the broom leans, and the room declares itself complete, at least until morning. Somewhere else, someone wakes briefly and reaches for the small glass on the nightstand. It measures nothing practical, just a personal unit called enough stillness to return to sleep. The person turns it and watches the cone grow with the slow confidence of gravity doing its job. A mind that has been hopping along fences all day steps off onto the grass. Thoughts condense into something reasonable, like a sentence or a yawn. The last thing seen is the suggestion of a last grain that may or may not have actually fallen. If it did not, it will, and if it did, it will again. The glass is not offended either way, and so the bowl rests in its frame. The frame rests on its table. The table rests on a floor that has learned the measure of this room. Time becomes domestic and therefore kind. Tomorrow, someone will turn the glass to measure an egg or a paragraph or an argument that should remain gentle. The sand, which has no philosophy other than down, will oblige. Hours will behave, not because clocks demand it, but because a simple shape taught us that most of life can be endured and even enjoyed as a series of tidy falls. The last grains settle with a hush that sounds very much like permission. You might not expect the width of a brick to decide how quickly a day gets tired, but it does very gently in towns where walls are built like lullabies. A brick is a patient rectangle with social skills. It prefers company, lime mortar, and a plan that is neither ambitious nor lazy. If you line up enough of them, they begin to count the afternoon for you in bands of red, buff, and it will dry lighter. The brick has 3 names for its faces: stretcher, header, and bed, as though it were an old traveler explaining how to nap on a train. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe, or simply keep listening to the mortar breathe. The wall won't mind, and neither will the evening dot in a quiet field upstream of town. The clay waits under turf like a long sentence. A digger with a spade cuts blocks, and the smell is part rain, part library. Clay is agreeable but not quick. It must be tempered with water, stomped by feet that develop the dignified shoes of patient work, and wedged on a board until it forgets its lumps. Brickmakers use molds dusted with sand so the clay lets go cleanly. They slap the clay in with a small confidence, slice the excess with a wire that sings one soft note, and tip the mold. Out slides a new brick, slick and willing. its edges a little proud. The next brick will be its twin because the mold says so. A pile of these twins becomes a family, and families, as every town learns, turn into streets. The sun is the first kill. New formed bricks lie in rows like polite books drying after a shallow flood. Children are warned not to poke the edges, which is an irresistible invitation to science. Once the bricks hold their shape, they go into Clamp's temporary kilns, stacked like careful arguments. A fire creeps through the clamp in a slow, logical map. The color deepens. The bricks arrive at something the trade calls hard enough. There are terms for every shade salmon for a shy underburn, cherry for a job well done, blue for when heat has gone ambitious and fused clay into something that sounds like it wishes it had been stone all along. A good yard shows all three in modest proportions. Variety is a style. Architects later call it texture. Masons call it honest. That measure begins to matter when the cart arrives. A hod can carry 12 bricks, or 14 if the hodman has an opinion about stairs. The common brick in many towns learns the habit of being roughly twice as long as it is wide, with a thickness that expects a finger of mortar above and below. The rule is simple: 2 headers equal a stretcher. It is so tidy that masons recite it like grace. The exact inches vary by country and century. The logic does not. A brick that can marry with any other brick reduces argument on the scaffold. When the bricks refuse to be agreeable, as in years of taxes or enthusiasm, the wall still rises. But it takes on a look, a bashful irregularity that later historians describe as picturesque, while a bricklayer wryly calls it my pension. There was, for a time, a tax on bricks. It made sense to someone with a desk. The rate was charged per brick, which made the nation's bricks put on weight the way soups do when a family comes to stay. Bricks grew larger to hold more house for the same money. Masons learned new rhythms, longer reaches, different lifts. Then the tax vanished, and the brick returned to a familiar size with the contented sigh of a belt notch discovered beneath a sweater. Old walls remember the tax the way trees remember. Draw out by the rings you can count if you put your face very close. On the scaffold, the wall organizes itself into bonds, which is what bricks call choreography. English bond alternates rows of stretchers and headers, the way a careful person alternates tea and water. Flemish bond arranges headers and stretchers. In the same course, a pattern so balanced that mathematicians smile. Garden wall bond, rat trap bond, monk bond, each is a way to keep joints from making long, persuasive lines that cracks could later read as maps. A brick aims to overlap its neighbors like a handshake that includes the whole neighborhood. You can walk through a town and determine the century of confidence by the bond that stares back at the street. Every brick has a bed, and it prefers to lie on it. Building on edge makes a thin wall that sounds hollow when you tap it, the acoustic equivalent of skipping breakfast. A proper bed SM soft mortar, not too shy, cradles the brick and spreads the load into many secret small opinions. Mortar is technology disguised as paste. Lime mortar cures by breathing. It takes in carbon from the air like a quiet fitness plan. Cement sets by internal chemistry. It does not ask the weather for permission. Old walls like lime because it forgives and uncomplains. New walls like cement because it means schedules. On mixed projects, the two mortar learn to nod at each other across centuries. The frog is an indentation on some bricks. A small central depression looks like a decision left for tomorrow. It reduces weight, provides a cavity for mortar, and offers an excuse for the cheerful phrase, lay frogs up. Apprentices are tested on frogs the way sailors are tested on knots. In certain places, frogs are absent. The brick is proud of its flatness. In others, frogs are deep enough to hide initials. Brickmakers stamp their names in dragon's teeth dates, marks, a town's whispered biography. Years later, restorers find one hidden in the bed and feel the warm, unnecessary happiness of being greeted by a person whose day ended before your grandparents met. A wall is a narrative interrupted by windows. Brick courses climb until a sill is needed, then a lintel, then a delightful puzzle called a segmental arch that allows the wall to appear nonchalant while actually performing a thesis on compression. Bricks make good readers of weight. When an arch is built, a wooden centering supports the curve until the keystone, the smug final brick locks. The whisper of forces into a smile. The centering is removed like a librarian removing a bookmark, and the arch remembers the story by heart. People tend to walk under arches with unearned confidence. If the arch has survived last winter, it will survive this conversation about soup. The bricklayer's day speaks in gauges. A course is a height plus a joint, and so many courses make a yard, and so many yards a comfortable argument with rain. To keep courses level across a wall, masons use lines stretched from profile boards, with a little weight hanging at the end that swings like a patient metronome. The line knows everything. The bricklayer touches it with the backs of knuckles and reads what the day wants. On windy afternoons, the line becomes philosophy and wobbles in agreement with every opinion. A good bricklayer learns to believe only the average of its moods dot in old cities. The brick weathers into its own catalog of verbs, spalls, flakes, blushes, salts. Salting efflorescence looks like the wall tried sugar and changed its mind. It is harmless most of the time, an aesthetic comment left by moisture commuting through pores. Spalling is more dramatic. The face pops off as if the brick practiced stage magic alone. Masons cure these with pockets of patience, repointing, shelter coats, small lectures about downspouts. If you listen near evening, a terraced street of bricks sounds like a village of kettles coming off the boil. Factories made bricks by the hundreds, then the thousands, then the week's entire talk. Extruders pushed clay into continuous bars that were sliced by wires like a loaf, whose slices went into architecture. The edges sharpened, frogs diminished. Sizes became sensible to accountants. Kilns learned to fire in long tunnels that fed one end with damp promise and sent the other end a conveyor of confidence. Yet a strange thing happened. Even perfect bricks remembered to vary their color. A wall without freckles looks nervous. Designers learned to mix palettes like salads. Perfection, left alone, is oddly loud. Brick quieted it with shade.cities, wrote regulations about bricks that read like lullabies to those already half asleep. Minimum compressive strength, maximum soluble salts, permissible curvature of the frog. A brick may deviate from straightness by a fraction so tiny that even a ruler must breathe in. Inspectors carry feeler gauges and a temperament that appreciates the company of reasonable numbers. On rainy mornings, they let samples recite their sorrow in water baths, then weigh them before and after in grams that behave like crumbs. The report concludes that the bricks are acceptable, which is the sweetest word in municipal English at eye level. Human hands meet bricks and leave a record of intending to touch again. Door jambs polish. Windowsills develop shallow dishes where elbows rested through generations of weather reports. Children discover that a small stone can trace mortar like a cousin of writing. In alleys, bicycles lean, and the brick accepts this responsibility with stoic pleasure. Cats perform gymnastics on garden walls laid in English bond because the alternating headers are small stages. In winter, bricks store the day's warmth and return it at a slow bedtime rate. Starlings find the temperature agreeable and discuss city planning. The discipline of bonding makes tiny jokes. A corner introduces coin bricks longer units that announce seriousness. String courses run around a building like belts with good posture. Dogtoothing appears under eaves, triangular projections that seem like architecture's attempt at dental comedy. If you ask a bricklayer whether these were necessary, The answer arrives in the soft future tense. They will have been traditional, which is how craft explains the mysterious joy of doing something. Precisely because other hands once did it similarly, restorers arrive with trowels like whispers. They read walls the way botanists read hedgerows, not just what is there, but what it implies. A patch in cement amid lime tells a story about a 1970s enthusiasm that hardened faster than affection. A vestigial chimney suggests a time when heat traveled upright. Where a doorway has been bricked up, the infill rarely matches, as if to remember that absence was once convenient. Tuck pointing appears fine lines of putty inserted into wider joints to simulate precision. It is architectural makeup and strangely moving, the wall's way of dressing nicely for the street. Bricks also go sideways into floors, particularly in barns and breweries, where moisture negotiates a treaty. Laid on sand, the bricks can be lifted for drains or secrets. In stables, a herringbone pattern feels good under hooves and pride. Breweries adopt heavy pavers that withstand the sociable accidents of barrels. The floor drains toward a runnel, which sounds like a word invented by water. After closing time, a broom and a hose reset the day, and the bricks darken to the color of contentment. Lest we forget, bricks are musical. Tap one with a trowel and it answers in a note that tells you if it left the kill with grace or with a hurry. Good bricks ring. Bad bricks thunk. The human ear, untrained but daily, can memorize a bell curve of quality in a week. Older masons have a repertoire of taps they use like a doctor's percussion on ribs. Now and then, a perfect chord rises from the stack and someone says, "That'll be a nice corner." Praise in bricklaying is conveyed in future tense and geometry. The sociology of bricks is thorough. In cold towns, walls are 2 bricks thick with a cavity, a slender window between, where air mindfully forgets to conduct heat. Ties bridge the gap at regular intervals, little pieces of metal writing letters nobody reads. In hot towns, walls shade courtyards. The shade cools the lemon tree. The lemon returns the favor to tea. A campus chooses a brick palette to look older than the students, and the students comply by becoming older, which is an impressive architectural effect. 19th century factories assert themselves in tall brick with arched windows, tallying shifts no longer kept. The buildings wake as studios, their bricks relieved to learn that they now measure paint instead of steam dot. There is, inevitably, graffiti. On new brick, spray paint looks like it arrived late to a party and chose an unfortunate hat. On old brick, chalk is more convincing, as if the wall itself wanted to write a grocery list. In certain neighborhoods, murals settle onto brickwork without a fight. The mortar lines run through them like staff lines in music. When the paint fades, the murals do not die. They age into allegories. A corner that once announced bicycles now dreams of them in Siena. Brick is loyal to color even as it forgets names. We must speak about repairs, the least dramatic love language. Repointing a wall, removing decayed mortar, and inserting fresh occurs at the speed of careful breathing. The old mortar comes out in gray confetti. The new mortar goes in with a grip that is firm but not boastful. The joint is tooled to a shape, flush, weather-struck, or a bucket handle, each with opinions about rain. A well-repointed wall looks much the same as before, which is the point. The craft's proudest sentence is, "You can't tell we were here." Bricks go to sea too as ballast. Ships need weight as surely as they need wind. On the return leg of voyages, holds were packed with bricks, especially from places with surpluses or ambitions. They traveled quietly and ended up as warehouses in distant ports, giving towns mismatched dialects of size and color. Port historians can tell you which quarter arrived by which tide. Somewhere there is a street where every third brick is slightly longer because a merchant misread a tariff schedule. Those are the small bureaucratic accidents that become charming dot in a garden. A small wall defines a border between time and not time. The wall's top courses are called the coping, which suits the therapeutic nature of gardening. Copings can be brick on edge or tile crusted, and they shed rain with a politeness that plants respect. Snails, who value roots more than destinations, learn the path of the joints and leave silver hieroglyphs that would be literature if we could read moisture. After dusk, the wall exhales the day, and the garden smells slightly of wet cookbook. Bricks suffer fools more kindly than most materials, but they do keep a ledger. If you stack them without bond, they move in slow-motion experiments that end with a neighborly thump. If you starve them of mortar, they drink rain and swell into melancholy. If you confine them with rigid cement and a breathing wall, they sulk and flake. Yet if you offer them good joints, a decent hat, and a dry pair of shoes coping above and damp-proof course below, they will stand there for your great-grandchild and ask only to be glanced at when the light is interesting. A final calm. In certain libraries, the walls are brick behind shelves, and readers sitting by windows feel a warmth that is not from radiators but from afternoons stored in masonry. The book's spines and the brick's stretcher lines rhyme accidentally. Someone turns a page and hears, faintly, the memory of a trowel drawing its gentle arc to finish a joint. Outside, rain starts, and the wall likes this because lime mortar enjoys a drink now and then. The city grows 1 hour older and slightly softer dot if the day has leaned against you like a stack of fresh bricks, warm, uniform, but insistent you can lie back and count bones instead of sheep. English, Flemish, like breath. Imagine a frog stamped with a date you never lived. Picture a hod climbing a ladder with a dozen small rectangles of patience. Somewhere a bricklayer wipes a trowel on his boot and considers whether the corner will be proud of itself when the scaffold comes down. He decides yes. He lays another course while the town drifts into the sort of evening when walls show their best tones and streets agree to be narrower for an hour. The mortar quiets, the line stills, the last brick rings once and then chooses silence. You might not expect the angle of a single bristle to decide when a city feels tidy enough to yawn, but that's the sort of quiet authority bristles have enjoyed for a very long time. A broom is nothing more than a handle, a bundle, and a promise to move dust from somewhere you notice to somewhere you don't, which is also the basic outline of politics. The earliest street orders were simple. Sweep your doorstep to the middle by dawn, and hope the neighbor across the way has the same understanding of the middle. If you're still awake by the time we reach the 19th century specification for acceptable scatter, feel free to subscribe gently, the way a hand settles on a banister in the dark, or don't. The broom will proceed at its own patient speed without keeping score. Clay. Stone and hooves made streets before people made rules for streets. Mess followed quickly, as mess does. In Roman towns, scavengers worked with rakes that sounded dignified but were really cousins of the garden kind, and with hand brooms bound from twigs called besoms. A besom is a small forest tied to a stick with confidence. Its bristles point wherever they want, like hair after a nap, which is exactly the energy you need to confront a marketplace at noon. Medieval ordinances limited the hours when sweeping was allowed. Not for noise, the noise was mostly the commentary of geese, but because dust rose and went sightseeing through open windows. By custom, water was sprinkled first, which made streets smell briefly like a damp chapel, limestone, bread, and hope. The tools stayed handmade for centuries. Broomcorn, that loyal sorghum with tassels as persuasive as a lecture, didn't become a global staple of sweeping until much later. Before that, willow twigs and heather did the work, and did it with a particular scratchy sound that tells you history is proceeding 1 square yard at a time. Broom makers learned the grammar of binding, lay, press, tie, repeat. 3 chords could hold a modest bundle. 5 chords suggested ambition. Handles were shaved round because square handles remind the hand of carpentry and lead to opinions. A good handle is an argument for moderation you can hold. The shakers, those detail enthusiasts with beautifully quiet furniture, flatten the cylindrical broom by pressing it in a vise and stitching it with broom wire so the bristles, fanned like a book laid open. The flat profile ate corners gracefully and made housekeepers serious about geometry. The stitch pattern itself became a signature. Some tied chevrons, others small diamonds. If you line up enough antique brooms, the stitching reads like the town's accent. Street sweepers, municipal edition, arrived with lanterns, carts, and a pace that adjusted to the width of their territory. A narrow lane demanded deliberate steps. A boulevard asked for a taller broom. The uniform cap, dark jacket, endless pockets turned human into metronome. They carried scoop shovels shaped like quiet boats, and their carts had bells they rang before shoving loads into communal heaps. The heaps became the special concern of night men and horses. There were disputes about heap diameter. A notice from 1823 suggests that a heap may not exceed 3 foot and 1 inch at the crown, which I have always admired for its willingness to imagine the crown of refuse. Morning customers complained when heaps wandered in front of doors. Heaps wander the way conversations do. Broomcorn itself has a nice biography. It is not corn, just as a walk is not a race. It is a type of sorghum that grows tall enough to reconsider its priorities in a breeze. The tassel, the part that becomes bristle, ripens into strands that are soft enough to persuade dust but stiff, enough to remember direction long enough to reach the curb. Broomcorn likes temperate weather, full sun, and the belief that it is being watched. In the 19th century, it found whole counties ready to encourage that belief. Bundles were harvested green, dried in long lofts that looked like sentences, and sorted by length, tailings for small jobs, long stalks for street work, and the proudest pieces for ceremonial sweeping, which is to say hotel lobbies. A street has preferred directions you notice only when you push dust. The crown shuts water toward gutters. Paving stones are laid in running bond, so joints stagger and don't whisper to your ankles. A sweep that works with those tendencies seems clever. A sweep that pushes against them merely gets stronger. There are moves, the fan, which arcs the broom like a slow wiper blade. The tuck, which elbows lint into the seam where curb meets road. The Vienna 8, an elegant figure 8, that makes tourists smile and pigeons suspicious, and the crosshatch, reserved for market squares, where waves of vegetable stubble, straw, and the polite confetti of ticket stubs refuse to respect jurisdiction. Dust is democratic and needs patient persuasion. The best sweepers learn a 45-degree stance and the small forward, shuffle that keeps bristles at the same angle throughout the motion. From above, a seasoned crew looks like the tide resigning itself to the beach. Municipal rules multiplied soft-voiced. Sweepers could not begin before 5 in the morning near bakeries because rising loaves were said to dislike surprise. In some districts, sweeping on Sundays was allowed only after church doors had closed and the week could safely lose interest in itself. There were height restrictions for heaps, as mentioned, and modesty requirements for carts, covered loads, no ostentatious spillage, and no dramatic banging of shovel against iron. If noise must be made, one regulation advised, let it be regular. Regular noise, it turns out, makes the human mind agree to rest. Regular noise makes it stand up with questions. The broom's head wears out at the corners like a person's most used shoes. Bristles always shorten on the right for right-handed sweepers, which teaches city managers a great deal about demographics without asking anyone's opinion. Handles lengthen over decades as bodies ask for kinder angles. The leather throat, a band that sits where bristles meet wood, collects the day's thumbprints and becomes, in older tools, a biographical strip, nicks from stone, tar that never entirely forgave, the occasional male scratch when the scoop got too friendly. Brooms stored bristles up invite gravity to help. Brooms stored bristles down acquire a pessimistic splay, then proceed anyway, like Uncle's mechanical help arrived because horses make opinions in the street that later become paperwork. The first practical street sweepers were horse-drawn machines with rotating drums wrapped in broomcorn, fed by pedals or chains from the axle. They trundled along, making a sound like upholstery being persuaded. Later, engines joined, and water tanks misted the ground to keep dust grounded. Some cities sent sprinklers ahead like a courteous letter. The drum flicked refuse onto a conveyor where it climbed into a hopper with the dignity of travel. The operator watched mirrors and listened for the eloquent rattle that meant the day's crop included bottled glass. Machines learned corners slowly. Humans, with their shoulder knowledge, kept the alleys for themselves. There were still evening crews with hand brooms because streets are made of exceptions. A city's map of exceptions is longer than its map of streets. Here a tram stop makes eddies every 15 minutes. There are fruit barrows peelings teach goals about calendars. Sweepers memorize these microclimates the way sailors memorize reefs and know where to salt corners with sand on foggy mornings, so bicycle tires end up making satisfied sounds. In winter, brooms turn to snow brooms, wider heads, stiffer bristles, and a proud intolerance for slush. On rail platforms, the snow broom moves like calligraphy to reveal the yellow line that reminds shoes of good decisions. In spring, the same broom coaxes wet petals toward drains and discovers the modest arithmetic of blossom fall. Some cities kept push roots for decades after machines arrived, in part because push roots keep gentle secrets. The sweepers saw every coin that tried to be anonymous, every button that escaped its station, every shopping list that clarified love. Lost property offices developed special trays for the day's sweepings, copper, keys, ribbons, the odd tooth that seemed bewildered but calm. There is a ledger somewhere where someone recorded one glove, left satisfied, proof that the clerk was paying attention to tone. The small economy of street pins used to secure notices to telephone poles formed a private currency. Sweepers slipped them into cap brims and walked out of the day with the sparkle of good planning. Brooms fascinated engineers because a broom is a model of probability you can hold. Bristle flex, friction coefficient of pavement, moisture percentage, particle size distribution. These are the ingredients of a quiet dissertation you could write in the back of a depot. There was, I'm told, a city where the Public Works Department experimented with bristle colors to see if yellow bristles reduced the number of birds who thought the head was a small portable nest. Results were inconclusive but charmingly argued. Somewhere else, supervisors trialed ergonomic handles shaped with a soft S, only to discover that sweepers preferred the old straight handle because it was an honest line to lean against. Honest lines win most arguments after sunset. Shifts ran on clock bells and on the slow choreography of shop shutters. The first pass happened when bakers were done and the street learned what flour considers reasonable. The second pass followed the midday crowd, who viewed sidewalks as temporary shelves. A third pass belonged to the afternoon wind. There were tea breaks under archways because arches project tea and gossip equally well. Some districts painted the ends of handles to match routes. Red for the market, blue for the river, green for the park with the civic statue of a person whose contribution has faded into the town's good mood. If a broom turned up in the wrong color zone, you could assume it had wandered off to see about a friend. Factories where brooms were born had their own bedtime rhythm. Bristle sorting is a whispering job, all slide and hush. The stitcher's palms learn to find tension by temperature. Too tight warms the wire, too loose stays indifferent. The press that flattened heads thumped the same way, looms thump softly, but with an old authority that reassures rafters. Finished brooms stood in review ranks like soldiers who long ago decided not to march. Labels read parlor, street, warehouse, or stable, tiny poems of purpose. Shipping crates went out with stencils that resembled travel documents for wooden citizens. To the depot, kindly, handle up, keep dry but not arrogant. Broom maintenance is another quiet world. You trim a tired head with shears the way a barber forgives a summer. You soak a brittle head in warm water to remind it that flexibility is a social skill. Some sweepers rub a little linseed oil into handles so the grain darkens and turns weather into patina. Others tie an admonitory ribbon around the neck red for nearly done, white for please be kind. There are handle ferrules that can be replaced, leather throats that can be restitched, and pride that can be polished by exactly one passerby saying, "That's a neat turn you made by the lamp." Pride needs just the one. The language of sweeping is deliciously specific, and almost nobody minds if you use it. There's the broom's reach, the semicircle you can cover without a step. There's the sneeze, the unhelpful clap of dust when bristles strike a careless fern. There's drag, the feeling of a soggy morning that makes rubbish act like it has roots. Proud describes a stone set slightly high. If your scoop catches, the stone is proud and needs a word with a mason. Blind corner is less dangerous than it sounds, mostly a place where wind and wall disagree, so refuse spins and sulks. A polite finish describes the last light pass that persuades a corner to admit it is clean. The phrases make a person feel, for a moment, that a street is something you could fold and put in a drawer. Every city quietly decides which direction its sweepers will push. Some go with traffic, claiming it soothes drivers to see purpose ahead. Others go against because eye contact is useful and causes fewer remarks shouted from windows in the key of suggestion. Cobblestones, when wet, offer commentary bordering on slapstick. Concrete is the polite cousin willing, flat, and slightly dull at parties. Asphalt is the moody one, soft in heat, brittle when cold, hiding secrets like chewing gum the way old books hide pressed leaves. A good broomhead acknowledges all. 3. The way a teacher acknowledges handwriting styles and keeps the lesson moving anyway. There's a plea every manual makes in a paragraph that might as well be printed on thick paper. Do not sweep leaves into drains. The temptation is understandable. Drains are the city's idea of a handbag, but leaves feel confident in crowds. They knit together and become little dams with delusions of grandeur. After a storm, a sweeper's hook retrieves clumped leaves from grates, and the water says thank you in the small accent of a relieved pipe. People watch the water rush away and feel a relationship to civil engineering that no monument can produce. Night sweeps have a different acoustics. The bristles are louder because the city is softer. Wheels on wet asphalt sound like coin slow dancing. Alley cats regard brooms as folklore. Shop shutters mutter metal syllables that mean tomorrow. Distantly, a bakery fidgets. The broom proceeds. If you look at the beam of the sweeper's headlamp, you'll see dust motes performing a modest astronomy lesson, constellations untroubled by names. This is the hour when the city shows the face it will present in the morning, as if dressing in the dark for a day it already forgives. There were, as everywhere, fads. A season of rubber squeegee brooms promised silence but delivered a squeal unpopular with windows. There was a year of anti-static bristle that made litter cling with the passion of a first crush. It was lovely until the head needed cleaning. There were experiments with scented sprays that made corners smell like citrus commentary. People liked it for a week, then returned to preferring the honest smell of clean damp, which is boring and therefore trustworthy. The best innovations stayed: reflective tape on handles for safety, a notch on the scoop so it hooks to the cart without falling off at dramatic moments, little brush and pan sets for cigarette islands outside offices that write emails about synergy. Somewhere in the archives lies a book of sweeping routes, a cartographer's quilt of blocks labeled with lap times and remarks. Gutter by now, 11 prone to argument. Watch sparrows near lime tree confident. Manhole lid sings E-flat in rain. An entry records that the southwest corner of the square collects buttons after market day. Another that Tuesday afternoons are straw events due to the arrival of hay for a small zoo whose animals, like senators, were admired through iron bars. Reading the book feels like turning the city inside out and finding that its lining is neat. Brooms changed when cars multiplied because curbs began to fear them. Parking schedules were written like lullabies. No standing from 8 to 11 on Tuesdays. For sweeping, a sentence that puts a neighborhood to bed in bands. Sweepers acquired chalk for tires and a gentle authority that can make a vehicle repent. Machines grew side brushes that reached under chassis the way a careful hand reaches under a sofa for a stubborn coin. Hydrants developed collars with notches that fit brushes like a handshake. The dance grew complicated but kept the same rhythm. Clean toward the curb, gather from the curb, go on. Every craft collects saints. Sweepers have Saint Monday, the day after a heavy weekend when the city needs more reassurance than courage. They have Saint Elbow, invoked when a stain acts like an optimist. They have the invisible saint of Don't Look Now, credited when a gust of wind returns the exact paper you just lifted. In depots, small shrines of utility knives, spare cords, and the one perfect screwdriver keep work steady. Someone will bring biscuits, and the day will agree to happen by late century. Vacuum sweepers joined, big, contented beasts that inhale instead of shoving. They wear brushes as whiskers, not as tongues, and roll slowly with the confidence of devices that can swallow a brick and burp politely. Operators wear ear protection that makes them look like thinking about music. The vacuum song is a comfort to sleepers who live above late routes, a steady, considerate hum that says the morning will arrive wearing clean shoes, what survives. Under all this machinery is the broom's original, logic, moving small adversities toward a place where they make sense together. The bristle still bends and lifts as it always did. The wrist still finds a friendly angle. The grain of the handle still teaches the palm about trees. There is a muscle in the forearm that remembers sweeping from childhood chores, and it wakes at the first repetition. Even a vacuum operator keeps a hand broom near the seat because machines respect corners from a distance but fear intimacy. The hand broom can visit. If you stand still long enough, you can watch a square clean itself by human intention. A team starts at the far edge, 2 brooms apart, and the first strokes redefine the day like erasers. Litter becomes a narrow country whose borders retreat. Edges become negotiations, then settlements. The swoop near the fountain is almost a bow. When the pile is finally gathered, neither too tall nor too optimistic, the scoop receives it, with the mild ceremony of a mailbox accepting a letter. The cart rolls. A boy's marble appears. The sweeper rinses it at the fountain and leaves it on the rim because return is one of the city's services. There are statistics for those who find them sleepy and therefore helpful. A good broom head lasts a season if no dog develops an opinion about it. A route of 1 mile consumes roughly 1¼ handles by splinters per year. The bristle angle of greatest satisfaction is 47 degrees, but 45 is easier to teach. A liter of water sprinkled calms 12 square meters of dust for 6 minutes. On a breezy day, which is just enough time for greetings. The average sheet contains 8 distinct stories, 3 of which are receipts. Buttons are mostly from coats that still have 3 other buttons, and coins are mostly of denominations that feel unimportant until counted. The day ends the way such days prefer, in inventory. Heads are checked, cords tightened, handles leaned in democratic rows, boots are scraped. A last cigarette happens just outside, and someone mentions the schedule for leaf season, which is like opera long, intricate, expensive, and not to everyone's taste, but still deeply civic. The depot door slides down, streets tick as they cool. The city, dust redistributed into meaning, drifts toward an arrangement of shadows that fits the hour. If a broom could speak, it would probably not. It would shake itself softly and wait. You would find it by the door, bristles resting inside an old cardboard box, handle pointing toward tomorrow in the polite way good tools do. The bristles, splayed exactly enough, would remember corners faithfully. The handle would remember hands. Outside, the curb would keep its slight smile, because curbs know a sweep is coming even if the calendar has lost interest. Somewhere, a small regulation about heap height relaxes. Night trains breathe. A paper cup rolls once and settles like a tired thought. And at the far end of the block, almost invisibly, dust begins to consider going home.